I am Brooke Warner, and I just wanted to say that I'm here with Piper Kerman, author of Orange is the New Black, and we just wanted to set a little bit of context for this conversation. I have been tapped to interview Piper because I am I am with, I should say, Karen. Piper is my neighbor, and Karen Haycox, who's the CEO, who's been in numerous chats today, is my partner. And so Piper and I live adjacent. We share a fence, and we met because I have a podcast, and I interviewed Piper and found out that she is my neighbor and that she also has a 9-year-old son. And so our boys are together in a pod. So we are sharing a breath network here.
That's right.
So Hello.
In the pod. Hello,
yes.
Podmate.
Welcome, Podmate. And hello, New York City. And we also want to give a shout out to the Women Build Council and just say thank you so much for sponsoring this part of the program. Yeah. So, Piper, I do want to just say everyone knows, of course, that you're the author of Orange is the New Black, which was an Emmy Award-winning Netflix series. You're also on multiple boards. I want to just acknowledge the Women's Prison Association and PEN America Writing for Justice Fellowship. Mm-hmm. And you also have a podcast, From Where She Stands, where you interviewed women who were in prison, but also the cast from Orange is the New Black, which was a really interesting conversation. And I want to mention that a little bit later.
That's right.
So to start, I wanted to ask you about some of your activism. I think that's a good place to kind of set the context for today. You're really involved in criminal justice reform. It seems like that's an adjacent issue to some of the issues that Habitat tackles. And so perhaps we can talk about your focus and how that came to be, which I'm guessing was just a natural offshoot of your time in prison plus writing the book.
Absolutely. Hello, New York. I'm a former New Yorker. I lived in Manhattan many years ago and then in Brooklyn for a long time. And I miss the city very much. So I know for the folks who are watching from New York, I want to send special love, and boy, do I miss the city. I can't wait to come back. So I was incarcerated from 2004 to 2005, and that year in prison is the fundamental content or story that is in my memoir, and the memoir was then adapted by Netflix into a much more broad and sprawling story because we were lucky enough to do 7 seasons. And of course, no memoir can fill 7 seasons of television. But I came home from prison in 2005. I was very lucky. I, grew up in a safe and stable home. I grew up in an apartment that my parents rented when I was a kid in Boston, and then they were able to buy a home when I was in middle school. And that was a big deal. My parents are both teachers. They didn't earn a lot of money. And then I was very lucky. I went to good public schools. I was fortunate enough to be able to go to college. Right. But I still ended up getting myself in trouble during that sort of decade of risk between 15 and 25, which is, true for most kids. Kids will take positive risks or they'll take negative risks depending on what's right in front of them. And I did end up serving a sentence for a crime that I committed. And that was a very transformative experience for me because I had been really insulated by all of the things that we associate with a stable middle class life, safe and stable housing first and foremost, access to good schools, which is so often connected to housing,
right?
Access to healthcare, all the things that make for a safer and more free life. And then I experienced incarceration, a system which is very intentionally designed in this country for some parts of the community and not for others. And I came home in 2005 and I realized that what I had just sort of witnessed and in some cases experienced was a great injustice. I pled guilty to my crime, like I did commit my crime, but what we have in our criminal punishment system does not really represent justice. And so many of the women that I served time with had dramatically different lives than me. In a lot of ways that tether into those systems that we just mentioned, housing systems, school systems, public health systems, and public safety systems. And when I came home, I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I knew that I couldn't just put that experience on a shelf, which, my sort of class privilege and skin privilege might have allowed me to do that. I really felt galvanized to try to do something. And the thing that made the most that I was able to do was to share my own story, because I did know that the perspective of, sort of a white, blonde college woman who lands in prison fit into the genre of the fish out of water. I always say that every prison story is a survival story. That's how bad our prisons and jails are. They are things that must be survived. But in my case, it was the fish out of water. Like, how will this particular fish survive here? So I'm just really grateful that the book found readers, and I'm very grateful that really smart and talented people wanted to adapt it. And that adaptation into the show brought these issues and questions about equity and fairness and gender and power to a much, much wider audience. And we included a lot of questions of housing justice in the storylines that were included in the show. And some characters like Tasty, like the beloved character Tasty, you see questions of housing and safe and stable housing very present in her story and the stories of many of the other women who are characters on the show.
Yeah, so I'm curious about that, because obviously there's the real women that you were incarcerated with, and then there are all the characters on the show, many of whom, as you said, are beloved by all kinds of watchers. And so this question of housing and stability, I was curious when you were in prison, which was 13 months, about the kinds of conversations that either did or didn't happen around housing. What did that look like? What is maybe one memorable one that stands out?
So one of the first questions around quote unquote housing in prison is the literal place where you are held. So when I was incarcerated, there were 3 dorms in the unit where I was incarcerated, which for many, many years had been segregated by race. So there was literally a dorm where almost exclusively Black women were put, one dorm where almost exclusively Latino women were put, and one dorm where almost exclusively white women were put. And an order had come down to the men who ran that unit and had been running that unit for decades that they had to desegregate the units. And so I was one of the first white women to live in the dorm that had primarily housed Black women. So literally in the system itself, there are these questions around housing and housing equity, because often, the white women would get the best dorm and the lights that worked, or, literally the maintenance of that dorm would be better than for the women of color. So there were so many conversations about housing, though, between the women who were incarcerated, because getting ready to go home, housing is your number one concern, right? Literally. So figuring out whether you had a place to go at all. I definitely knew women who were released from prison who went straight to homeless shelters. I knew women who were released from prison who were really dependent on the largesse of their families and the situation of their families in order to have a safe and stable place to live. And there were a lot of women I knew who did not have a safe and stable place to live. They may not have gone to a homeless shelter, but they did go to a place which was challenging and difficult to live, and sometimes a threat to their safety, or sometimes a threat to their freedom. Because, for example, if they went to a place that, if they had a drug conviction, like my own drug conviction, and they went to a place where there was a lot of drug activity, they could easily be sent back to prison, and not necessarily through their own serious mistakes. So these questions dogged people. And I remember a woman from my dorm who had been released, and she had gone home, and she was a friend of mine, but we were not so close that she was going to be writing me letters. But I asked someone who she was really close, "Oh, how's she doing?" And she said, "It's tricky. She had to go to her mom's house. That was the only place she had to go. And it's not a good situation." And so literally the first step in the pathway to freedom after incarceration is to step into a place to live that is going to be safe, that is going to be a place you can count on and is not a place that is going to threaten your freedom.
Right, absolutely. And we talked a bit about this earlier, just all the different people that in your life you might be connected to who may be impacted by prison. So like if you're a mom and your son has a prison situation, incarcerated or whatever,
or just even a criminal record,
it can
right, just be something as simple as an arrest,
right,
that can be a disqualifier for housing in many cases, especially for poor families. So families that rely on housing assistance, whether it's Section 8 housing or other forms of public housing, are always under threat of losing their housing assistance if anyone in the family gets involved in the criminal justice system. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a conviction for that family, the entire family, to be impacted by the criminal justice system.
Exactly.
Very unfairly.
Very unfairly. And so we're just, speaking of all of the awareness, this year in particular, but it's of course always been there for someone like you who's been working in criminal justice reform, of the systemic issues facing general populations. And one of the things I was curious about, because you told me some stories just about, like you said, being white skinned, having a very different kind of experience, writing your story, and in essence, getting famous in some ways from having this story that for other people might be an impediment to a job or to housing. And so I'm just curious about your awareness of that, how you think about it. And like if, for instance, have you ever been in a situation yourself where you've had to disclose having a criminal record and that having been an impediment? And then maybe a story of, all the many women for whom that's true. Maybe it's a disqualifying situation for a job or housing.
There are literally tens of thousands of post-conviction either laws or other policies that essentially discriminate against people who have some past prior involvement with the criminal justice system, including a conviction, but not necessarily only incarceration. And those include many, many things on housing statutes or access to housing. They also limit people's access to educational assistance. For years, we've had to fight off every single year the federal government trying to impose limits on people being able to get food assistance if they have a criminal conviction. So many of those things are not things that directly impacted me because I was fortunate enough to come from a family where I didn't have to worry about food stability or housing stability. When I came home from prison, I had, a fiance who had a safe and stable place for me to live. And I was acutely aware of that because I knew that these other women, many of whom I cared about very much, were not enjoying the same kind of safety and freedom that I was, even as I carried that felony conviction with me. There are many, many things that hold people back. And I would say unfairly. And so I'll give a really simple example that many people can relate to. In many places, I used to live in Ohio. Under Ohio state law, I would never be allowed to chaperone a kid's school trip because I have a criminal conviction, even though my criminal conviction has nothing to do with violence. It has nothing to do with children. And those kinds of things are incredibly common, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So you can chaperone field trips for our kids now that you're in California.
Well, there are no field trips right now, are there?
Once we can do that again, you'll be the first person I tap. So about the book, what was the inspiration to share that story? I mean, that's just the simplest of questions, because like you said, you could have just shelved it, could have said, I'm just going to try to ignore that. But now, everyone, your family, your friends, and the world knows this story of having not only of your 13 months in prison, but also of, what happened in the conviction and the felony. So just what was the inspiration? Then obviously, what is it like to live with that now this many years later?
I just believe firmly, based on my own experience and the experiences of my friends and my family, many of whom couldn't believe that I would be sent to prison 10 years after committing a first-time nonviolent offense. many of whom visited me in prison and couldn't believe the level of repression and unfairness and punitiveness that is directed towards, prisoners all over this country in all kinds of different facilities. And couldn't believe sort of the unfairness. My friends, my family would come and visit me and see other families in the visiting room, see young children whose mothers were incarcerated, who were trying desperately to sort of maintain those maternal bonds and keep those families together. I just knew that in my own experience, there were many, many people who were blessedly unaware of how the criminal justice system is operating in this country and what was happening to not only individuals, but to families and communities. And I was really a firm believer that if people were simply willing to sort of walk in my shoes or put themselves in the shoes of the other women who I was incarcerated with, that they would think and feel differently about the fact that we incarcerate more of our own people than any society in human history has ever done. No society or culture has ever incarcerated so many of its own people. We have 70 million people in this country who have some form of a criminal record, even if it's an arrest that didn't result in a conviction. But those things can be big impediments to things like housing justice. And, 25% of American women have a loved one, a parent, a child, a spouse, a sibling who is either in prison or has been in prison, which is staggering. So when we think about, the Women's Building Council, and we think about women's specific needs for safe and stable housing and their pathways to gain housing and to provide housing justice to women, we have to think about the criminal justice system, because literally 1 in 4 women, her family is tangling with the criminal justice system in some way. And that can really impact the ability of a family to be safe and to have a safe place to live. And I just want to make the point, if we're worried about crime and safety, often it's injustice in these other systems that send individuals into the criminal justice system in the first place, right? So many people commit crimes in order to try and gain some sense of safe and stable housing for their families, or to try to preserve what they have managed to get in terms of a roof over their families' heads and the ability to keep them safe and keep them together.
Well, and I'm so glad you wrote the book. I know when I read it, I was incensed at lots of different moments, but you do a good job of showing, like anger, but not, being lecturing in a sense, right? Like how unfair this is. And I remember there was one story in particular of a woman who was just sort of peripherally involved, I think maybe in like a nephew's drug ring. And she was just like taking phone calls. And then of course ended up with this like really intense sentence. And so I thought, and especially because we have, the Women Build Council that we're talking about today, women's issues. Obviously you're a woman, you were in a women's prison, you've since worked in teaching in women's prison as well. What are some of the issues? You've spoken to it a little bit, but what do you think are some of the issues that are unique to women's prisons and maybe that uniquely need to be fixed about how we think of women and incarceration?
Well, when I think about Habitat and, who Habitat serves and what families are most likely to qualify and to end up, amazingly moving into Habitat homes, many women that Habitat serves are single heads of household with minor children. And that is the majority of women who end up in the criminal justice system as well. The vast majority of women who end up in the system are moms, and the majority of those moms are moms of minor children, and most of those moms are single heads of household.
Right.
And so when we think about access to safe and stable and affordable housing, and the overlays between a criminal justice system, a housing system, a banking system, which is not always fair and equitable, you literally see how these systems very significantly overlap. And that if we get different results for the people who are impacted by these systems, suddenly we get much better results for the community overall, not only for those individuals, not only for those families, but for the community overall.
And I wanted to talk about this article that you wrote just last year about the carceral state and its impact on democracy. I mean, it seems like an important thing to tie into today. We're only a week away from the election. I mean, we're living in this crazy time right now. I mean, you talk about just the explosion in imprisonment rates and the impact on democracy in general, right? And then we have Trump, who, is openly calling for segregation in certain places in suburbia and elsewhere. And so I just wonder, like, in your world and how you think about these things, I don't even know what my question is. Like, what is the biggest problem? What is the biggest threat to our democracy? How do we fix things? Just if we're kind of on the ground and care about these issues.
Yeah. So this incredible growth in what we call the carceral state or the carceral system is a relatively recent development during our lifetimes, right? Really only the massive buildup of not just the prison population, but also an overinvestment in policing and de-investment in other systems, which are actually what really make us safe. Things like safe and stable housing, public education. So those things have all really transpired, especially since the 1980s during my lifetime. And so knowing that this is a relatively recent development makes me very hopeful that we can totally change it. And we do. We have the power to change it. But some of that power comes from things like the ballot box. And that's where you see that the carceral state is actually affecting democracy. So we look at many states that have high African American populations, for example, and those are the states that are most likely to have felony disenfranchisement. African American communities have been most targeted for incarceration, right? So there are women that I was incarcerated with who are African American, who I had a 15-month sentence. They had a very similar charge. They got much longer sentences, much longer sentences. So we see that people are being taken out of the community, literally, in systems of incarceration. We see that when people return to the community, they are often disenfranchised. So if there's been a battle over Florida, the biggest swing state there is, more than 20% of people in the African American community were not able to vote for their entire lifetime because of felony disenfranchisement. So when you take an even bigger step back, though, and think about the housing systems and how these different justice systems or injustice systems mesh together, what you ultimately see is this question of inclusion or exclusion, right? So the criminal justice system is fundamentally a system of exclusion. It is a system of banishment, like sometimes the physical banishment of a prison cell. But also there's all these other ways that the system works to exclude people from full citizenship. And we also see that that's true when we look at things like housing systems, that not all people have equal access to safe and stable housing. Not all people have equal access to loans, right? That we have a banking system and a funding system for housing that is exclusionary. It does not include everyone equally. And so, that's sort of a Gordian knot, because it's really important that we do everything we can individually and also collectively to make our community an inclusive community. And we have to look at things like justice. When it comes to housing, we have to look at things like making sure that people are not excluded from voting. We have to make sure that, frankly, things like the quality of schools are not tied to housing, which is so frequently the case. High value housing brings with it high value schooling, and low income housing, brings with it, an inadequate investment in things like public education. So these systems can seem really overwhelming, and yet, here we are with our number one opportunity coming up or happening right now in terms of voting. Right. So.
I mean, my gosh, and just how much these things are interlocked, like as you're saying, just feels so complicated. I mean, I have a friend who's shopping for a house right now, and that's the very first thing they look at is the schools and the metrics, and it's all a larger piece of a whole, of course. I wanted to ask about well, actually, I thought we might turn to ask like a couple of fun questions,
Sure.
just because I know we have fans out there. And so about working with the cast of the show, I'm curious about, well, you and I were talking once about how this show, how Orange is the New Black, gave so many really interesting roles and opportunities for women actresses who maybe don't often have the opportunity to be such nuanced and kind of complicated characters. So I was wondering about how, just your experience of the cast versus the women that you knew in real life, you know, and like, what was that like for you to see them come alive? And were they very much like their own characters, or did you feel that they were representative of the women you knew?
Well, there are some beloved and important characters in the show who are directly taken from the book. But when I say directly taken, you know, Pennsatucky, you know, there's a woman called Pennsatucky in the book. There's a woman called Crazy Eyes in the book. You know, the character of Red has a close analog to a woman called Pop in the book. But all of the backstories on the show are fictional. So, you know, that's the beauty of the show, is that, you know, it takes the book as a sort of jumping off point. But those characters are really reimagined in many ways with backstories that are simply not contained in the book at all. Or, you know, in some cases, I touch a little bit on a woman's backstory in the book. But the backstories in the show are really unique. And so it is interesting for me personally, having known both, you know, the women that I was incarcerated with and also some of the characters, you know, specifically those characters. You know, Yoga Janet is from the book. You know, readers of the book know that Yoga Janet, and there's this wonderful character played by Connie Schulman on the show. You know, Sister Ardith Platte, you know, my beloved friend, just passed away.
I saw that.
Yeah, and there's a character who's based on her in the show as well, though the character on the show is very different than Sister Ardith. Sister Ardith was, I think, 84 and was a political prisoner. You know, she basically was incarcerated by the federal government for more than 4 years for a nonviolent protest at a missile base with 2 other nuns. So, you know, if you want to know what the government's doing, it's locking up nuns. But I was really grateful that the show just brought such an incredible breadth of women's stories to life. So it's so rare, first of all, for any TV show to have so many female characters, and for the characters to be so juicy, and for them to be old and gay or trans or, you know, women from all different walks of life, all different ages. I actually think the inclusion of older women's stories in the show was really, really important. And that is an accurate reflection of what life in prison is. I mean, you are living in incredibly close quarters with so many different people. The majority of people in prison are poor and come from poor communities, but not everyone. And particularly a federal prison, you're more likely to get some middle-class prisoners. But I think that's the reason that the show attracted such a huge and passionate audience, is because Hollywood has not served reality and real women's stories very well historically. And so particularly when we first got started in 2013, there was almost nothing like Orange is the New Black on television. And I think we really proved that there's an enormous audience for women's stories and for diverse women's stories, not just rich white women's stories.
Yeah, and I think that's being proven out these days. You know, certainly a lot of the initiatives, I mean, I come from the publishing industry, so there's so much there around wanting to tell all kinds of stories. And so speaking of storytelling, I mean, you then spent 4.5 years in Ohio teaching in both a men's prison and a women's prison. And so talk about that process of, has that been about wanting to help other people tell their stories? Or, I mean, I know you're also writing a book about your time there.
I am at work on another book. It's coming along slowly. I just have a passion. I mean, having been incarcerated, I know that people have incredibly fascinating lives, incredibly interesting stories to tell. And not only from my time of incarceration, but also from, you know, the work that I've done since I was incarcerated with, so many people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. Their lives are really interesting. Their stories are really important and often undervalued or overlooked. Also, there is a huge educational gap. So 2/3 of people who end up in prison or in jail lack even a high school diploma. But that doesn't mean they're not smart, and that doesn't mean that they don't have incredibly interesting stories. So one of my goals in teaching in state prisons was to give my students more tools with which to tell their stories, because I knew that their stories would be interesting and important. And that was certainly proved true. It was sort of fascinating to teach, it's the exact same class, but I taught it in a men's medium security prison and the primary women's prison in Ohio, which holds all kinds of women convicted of all kinds of different crimes, as does the men's prison. It was sort of fascinating to see the similarities and the differences between how men and women think about narrative and think about their own stories and think about things like what makes for a protagonist, like what kind of stories are worth telling, because we designed the class to afford a great deal of freedom to the students to choose what stories they wanted to tell and how they wanted to tell them within, some framework. And I did feel like gender made a big difference in some of the ways that my students went about writing or what they wanted to write about.
It's interesting because we have another author who heads up like an arts program in prisons here in California. And of course, a lot of that funding is being cut all over the place. And she was really making a point that having that kind of creative outlet was incredibly important for confidence and for, that once the people were getting out of prison, that oftentimes if they had something like that, they were likely to land in a better place. And so I'm wondering if that was part of the initiative at the creative nonfiction program.
Well, actually, it's really interesting. This was brought to my attention not in starting the writing program, but in the process as I had been doing it for several years. And a fabulous woman I knew in Ohio who had been working in the prisons as a volunteer and as a sort of incredible change agent for decades said, "Oh, have you ever read any of the research on desistance?" And I was like, "No, what are you talking about?" When we talk about the criminal justice system, there's this huge focus on recidivism, right? Recidivism is when you have been convicted of a crime and then you are sent back to prison or caught doing another crime, right? So we don't want that, right? We want people to, be able to lead their lives in ways that are safe, both for them and for other people. So desistance, but recidivism is just really the people who get caught. It doesn't really have much reflection on the reality of people's lives. Desistance is the ability to actually stop doing something and start doing other things. So what we should really be focused on is desistance. If somebody has a drug problem, if somebody has been engaged in, interpersonal violence, if somebody, has been making their living by, robbing convenience stores, we want them to desist, right? We want them to stop doing that. And what the research on, academic research on desistance shows is that narrative actually plays a huge part in people's ability to desist. In other words, there's an existing story about themselves, about their lives, about where they come from and who they are, which has been established, which is often connected to the antisocial behavior that we want to stop. And to move forward and to be able to actually desist and change your life requires a narrative change. It requires being able to write a new story for yourself, both about your current condition and also about the future that you want for yourself. And so that narrative piece, which I had already been working on for several years, actually had this sort of pretty concrete research-driven benefit to my students and also to society as a whole.
It's fascinating that you bring that up because Karen actually had turned me on to this webinar last week that had Sherilyn Ifill and Brian Stevenson. So Sherilyn's from the NAACP and Brian Stevenson, you share a publisher with. He wrote Just Mercy.
And he founded the Equal Justice Initiative.
Right. Yeah. I think that is actually what the webinar was for the Equal Justice Initiative. And so one of the things that kind of blew my mind about their conversation was they were saying, we've won all of these legal initiatives and we've done a good job, scoring legal points, but we've lost the narrative, right? So they were really talking about why are we seeing this resurgence of white supremacy and what's going on, and part of the point they were making is that the narrative has sort of been like, oh, okay, well, you're a white supremacist, but there's no real ramifications. There's no real change going on in the society. And in some ways, we're still the same as we've always been. We're the same that we've always thought since well before the civil rights movement. So I appreciate what you're talking about, because I think that I think what I'm trying to get to is right now, it seems that what's happening in this moment, and has been happening since May, is a real change in the narrative. I mean, I see people that I've believed, are pretty progressive people having a complete turnaround in thinking about all kinds of issues around social justice, equality. And I'm curious, in your world, if you feel that. I mean, because you run in different circles than me, do you see people kind of waking up in a whole new way? And obviously this is more white people, because the people of color are sitting here being like, it's always been this bad. And so I'm just curious.
I mean, I definitely think, my book was published in 2010. That's the same year that the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's sort of watershed analysis of the criminal justice system's use as a tool of control over communities of color, was also published that year. So gradually over the last 10 years, I think we have seen a shift in the narrative for many people about carceral systems, criminal justice systems specifically. I do believe that in the last year, we have had a very significant awakening among many people who were asleep to the threat of authoritarianism in this country. And that is a threat that communities of color, African American communities, Native American communities, Latino communities, have known for a long time. It's been a part of their daily lived existence that it wasn't necessarily safe to call the police if there was a problem, right? That the police were not actually going to be agents of help for if you were from a community of color. I think that a lot of people have awakened to some of those realities. It's always a question of cognitive dissonance for a lot of white people, I think, when sort of if you're a middle-class white woman, your interactions with police are probably profoundly different than if you are a Black man who lives in a poor community. And so I think for white people, it's very hard to handle that cognitive dissonance. But I do have some optimism that the conversation has changed. And I hope it has changed in a way that's going to stick.
Right.
And that we don't backslide, into a greater sense of quote unquote normalcy, when what was normal was not actually really acceptable if we want to be a truly inclusive society, right? Because it does come back to that question of, who's getting included in decision making, the communities which are the most free are always the most safe. And the communities which are the least free are always the least safe. So people will often present safety and freedom as this false choice that we have to make. But in fact, those two things are completely intertwined. And we don't get one without the other.
Right. That's a fascinating way to look at our own existence and kind of the communities that we live in, and where are we free and where are we safe? I mean, I think, one of the things that occurs to me all the time is we live down here in West Berkeley, and there's tons and increasingly more, it seems, homeless encampments. And we've been, you and I have talked about this, you walk by and on any given day, they're giving services, setting up porta potties and giving them a dumpster, and then the next day clearing them out, and there's just this lack of agency. I mean, so that's what made me think of that when you're saying freedom, there's just, it is a Gordian knot, as you said. I'm curious about, this is kind of a simple question, but what do you think was the most profound impact in terms of how prison changed you as a person?
I was raised in a progressive household. As I said, my parents were teachers. They were sort of public servants. Definitely, ideas of being a contributor and ideas of equity were not new to me. But there's a radical difference between having some of those ideas in an abstract way and living through a really intense situation where inequality is so blatant. Mm-hmm. And so if if you've never thought about the criminal justice system before and you've never really taken a hard look at it, just a fairly cursory examination shows that it's a glaring example of inequality in this country on many levels, not only racial, also class and income inequality. So I just feel like when you go through an experience like that with other people who are really important to you, and you walk away and you're like, wow, my good fortune follows me. I want the good fortune that I enjoy to be something that everybody has. I just think that that's as indelible as a prison tattoo, right? I think that's why, Bryan Stevenson, to go back to Bryan Stevenson, one of the things that Bryan Stevenson always counsels to each and every one of us who wants to make a difference is proximity. So, we do not solve problems of justice in our community from a distance. So it requires getting in there. I mean, that's the beauty of Habitat for Humanity is that like people help in all kinds of different ways. But one of the ways that people help is they go and do a build, right? They go and they get proximate to the problem and proximate to the solution as well. And that is, I think, what is truly transformative for people. And that making sure that for those of us who are fortunate that we intentionally get proximate to the problems that concern us, or even problems that perhaps we haven't really thought about, that's what I think really creates a foothold for change and gives us the momentum that we need to actually make change on things. And when we start to change some of these systems, those changes are going to, I don't know if bleed in is the right analogy or metaphor, but those changes will impact. So for example, if we start to eliminate some of the discrimination that lives in our housing system, we're going to see changes that take place, whether it's in the criminal justice system or the public education system. We'll see more progress.
Yeah, personally, I just had the opportunity to do 2 builds with Karen last year before COVID struck and kind of knocked them all out for this year. But we built in Tennessee, for the Carter Project. And one of the things that I was so moved by was being proximate on the one hand and building with all these other people, but how the families also built, right? So it's like there's agency on both sides with a program like Habitat where all these people are coming to do something meaningful, but that the families themselves are building their own houses. It's incredible. And I was just thinking about how powerful that is for the kids, to watch their mothers, usually sometimes fathers too, but build their own houses and then come and move in and the generational impact of this stuff. And since we're wrapping up, I think that might be an interesting last question to end on, because one of the things that you're talking about is the proximity and these various things we can do. We can vote, we can get involved, but this question about changing, what was the word you used, when you were talking about recidivism, we're stopping your behavior.
Recidivism, sorry.
No, it's okay. I put you on the spot. Whatever that word was, like stopping what you're doing. Desistance. And one of the things about desistance, it seems to would be the reverberating effects of the next generation, right? Like
absolutely.
When there's generational crime and then doing something different. So
absolutely, yeah. And yeah, we know that that's true. We know that when we help an individual, that very rarely is that person the only person who's benefiting from help or from a boost or from, whatever we do to strengthen that person's ability to see their life in whatever terms they want to see it in, that has this reverberating effect for kids, for also anybody within that extended family network.
Yeah, no, and that's huge. And we're wrapping up, but just because you are finishing this second book and there's a continuation of these issues that you care about, I mean, is there any single, thing that you're like wrestling with right now that you're kind of hoping to put on the page or to tell people about criminal justice reform?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that I was interested in going to Ohio and doing this program in Ohio and doing this work is that many of my students have very serious crimes of conviction. There, you know, when I was incarcerated in the federal system, there were a lot of women who were there for low-level drug offenses like my own. If you go to certain state prisons, you will find people who have been convicted of, you know, armed robbery or sexual assault or, you know, all kinds of more serious things. For us to really have a change in mass incarceration, for us to really not lead the world in incarceration, we have to not only stop locking up women like the women I did time with, but we also have to think and act very differently towards the men and women who I taught. And we have to have different responses to violence in our community, and we have to have different, we have to be much more serious about preventing violence. The ways that we go about it currently don't work. And we know they don't work. And so the question, I mean, that is the big challenge of this book for me personally, and also for us as a society, is this question of reconciliation. Right. So when harm takes place, you know, whether it's a crime or whether it's not a crime, we have to think really seriously in this country about what our ideas about reconciling the reality of what's taken place with what we also know about that person that is broader, and also what the person who's been harmed needs and wants. Because right now, all we offer them is retribution, and really all we offer survivors of harm is possibly to put someone in a prison cell. And that's just not getting us good results as a society. And for many survivors of harm, that's actually not what they want or not what's most important to them. So we have to be a lot more thoughtful, and that's very challenging, right? It's not a small question, but America needs to really rethink the punishment paradigm, which we have been so committed to because it is profoundly exclusionary and only continues those cycles of retribution rather than healing them. So that's really the substance of the next book, and it's really hard.
That is hard and so important. So thank you, and thanks for laying that all out. And I have a few things to close on, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to remind everybody that tomorrow's live stream event is free, so you can invite your friends and family to join that. I'm personally looking forward to seeing the Empire State Building light up in Habitat's colors. That's going to be super cool. And I did want to thank the Women Build Council again for this event, for bringing Piper and I together like this, and looking forward to being able to build again in person when we can do that.
Yeah.
And this is a fundraising event. I hope that everybody out there has joined us because you actually donated, but let your friends and family know, help Habitat make its goals. It's such an important organization, and we thank Habitat for all the work that they're doing. So again, hello, New York City. Goodbye, New York City. Thanks for having us.